Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Cathedral Basilica of St. John the Baptist. My name is John Fitzgerald. I'm the Executive Director of the Basilica Heritage Foundation, and to put on another hat, I've been sort of the convener, not quite the chair, of the organizing committee for this terrific visit we've had from our friends from Ireland and Ambassador Mcke of the Embassy of Ireland in Canada. It's been an absolute joy and pleasure to be able to be a part of this incredibly moving series of events, liturgy, and visit, bringing these unspeakably moving bronze shoes to perhaps the oldest part of North America where the Irish landed and arrived. This afternoon, we have a very informal, if I can put it that way, approach to things here. I'm going to introduce both Ambassador Mcke and Dr. Mark McGowan. I'm going to introduce Carolyn Callery and John Mannion. And then, after they do some presentations, I'm going to give a very brief presentation. And then my colleague, my friend Ann Walsh, the chair of the Basilica Heritage Foundation, is going to take over, and we're going to have a roundtable discussion, really on what you hear, what people's reactions are to what you're hearing, and also questions from the floor. So there's a lovely unimic set up there, and if people have reactions and things to say and questions, that will be a wonderful opportunity for interaction. So let me begin. I'm not going to make this a very long or diplomatically perhaps even correct, but His Excellency Eamon Mcke is the Ambassador of Ireland to Canada. He has been the champion in Canada of the global Irish Famine Way project. He's been a champion of Irish-Canadian history. He and Mark McGowan have been very active, very involved in promoting and telling the stories of Irish Canadians, including our own Bishop Fleming. And Eamon has a PhD in history. He's a very smart fellow, but there are a few forces of nature up here on the table, and he is most definitely one of them. So I could call him His Excellency, but he's been a tremendous friend to Newfoundland and Labrador, so I'm going to invite him up to talk to you about what we desperately want to hear more of. So thank you so much.
Thank you, John. It's a real pleasure to be here. It was about 5 years ago. Myself and Mary sat at the kitchen table and decided she told me we had one more adventure in us, and we decided to figure out where was that. And by a process of elimination, we ended up with Canada. And very unusually in my department, I asked for it and got it. And normally never happens. In my department, you could spend your life learning German and never get a posting there. It's just, I don't know how they figured it out. It's kind of Jesuitical, I think. But Canada was a bit of a mystery, and in foreign affairs we tended to send people who were retiring or who were very good diplomats, because there was always this kind of complication about Canada. There was the Quebecois issue, but there was also the fact that as part of the Commonwealth it shared a monarch with Britain, obviously, and Queen Elizabeth II was commander of the British Army, and therefore there was a complication about Northern Ireland. And it kind of kept Canada at a distance. And over the years, and I think it dates from 2011 when Queen Elizabeth II visited Dublin and Ireland generally, that we became much more comfortable with Canada. If we could solve and heal the wounds with England after all those centuries as a product of the peace process, then we're much more comfortable with Canada. But on coming here, you know, your impression of Canada is kind of expressed by the coat of arms. It's very royal, it's very British, and you see this coat of arms. And my assumption was that most of Canada was very Protestant, royal, and British. And then I started to discover in and around Ottawa this incredible Irish presence. And I began to get to know the Irish community in Ottawa. Got to know the great people in a small hamlet called Douglas, which is about an hour and 40 minutes west of Ottawa. We went there, my wife and I, Mary, in St. Patrick's Day last year, drove along these frozen roads and grey skies. I said, what are we doing here? Why are we going here? And there was a barn, and it was the Cull Farm. And then we opened up the door, and there were 300 mad Irish people in there celebrating St. Patrick's Day. And it was like stepping through a space-time continuum. It was like, oh my God. And I said to them, you never know when you go to these things, are you going to find 7 people on a couch and chair or what? And these 300 Irish people. And what was amazing in talking to them, they were all very committed to their Irish heritage. They all knew when they came in, 1820s, 1830s. One of them said, well, we came in with a famine, but we don't like to talk about it. And then I was talking to the 2 old farmers there. One of them was Terry, and I said, you've got Irish accents. And he says, yeah, everybody thinks we're newfies. And it's quite funny, you go up there, and I got to know them, and then I was up the Gatineau Valley, where there's Low and Venosta. You go up to the graveyard in Farrelton, it's like an Irish phone book. And the whole of the Gatineau was farmed by the Irish. And then if you go out to, all of Pontiac was Irish, Renfrew, Almonte. In 1871, Smith Falls, the census of 1871, in Smith Falls, half of the people there were Irish born. They were cleared off the land in the Colatton estate in Wicklow and moved around that area. So this began to change my image of the place, that this was really quite a revelation of the extent of the Irish settlement in the whole of the Ottawa Valley. And then looking into the lumber industry, I started hearing about John Egan, who came in 1830 from Galway, pretty much penniless, but became one of the richest lumber barons and leading politicians in the area. Discovered Andrew Leamy from Tipperary, another great lumber baron. And in looking at this, it turns out that the Irish were not just lumberjacks and labourers, but they were business people. And even halfway between Ottawa and Montreal, there's the Hawkesbury Mills. And the Hawkesbury Mills were set up by George Hamilton from Dunboyne. And his uncle, Henry Caldwell, who was a famous soldier in Quebec, he had been involved in both sieges of Quebec. In 1804, Henry Caldwell from Ireland had convinced the British Admiralty to get your lumber from Canada. Don't take it from the Baltic anymore. And he was 2 years ahead of his time, because in 1806, there was the Napoleonic blockade. And the Admiralty agreed to them in 1804. So he tells his cousin, his nephew by marriage, George Hamilton, get over here. And Henry Caldwell had a very good business milling flour. He switched his mills to lumber. And that's really the start of the Canadian lumber industry, where Irish people are actually right at the heart of it. And then if you move forward, J.R. Booth, son of Irish immigrants, by the end of the 19th century, J.R. Booth is the richest man in Canada, because he had the largest lumber operation, and he was the largest private railway owner. Tom Ahern, son of an Irish blacksmith in Ottawa, was the Edison of Canada. You know, it's a huge influence. I began to discover what was said to me at the beginning by people like Mark McGowan and Michael Keneally, our honorary consul in Montreal. He says, you have to understand that the Irish presence in Canada is the creation of identities, multiple communities all over Canada, changed and shaped by the environment they landed in. So the Irish community could be different depending on whether you were growing, your neighbours were Orangemen, for example, in Toronto, or whether they're French Quebecois in Montreal and Quebec City. It all depended. They were all shaped, but each of them kind of carried their Irish heritage as almost sacerdotally from one generation to the next. So I became very curious about what was the big picture. Because in Irish America, they have a reflex about what the big picture is, and in here, you don't have that picture, and I've been trying to piece this together. So very briefly, I would say that there's a number of 4 or 5 waves of Irish that come in. And the first wave is in Newfoundland, where you have fishermen coming in seasonally, and then, of course, they come in and stay, and they build a community. But we really don't know who they were, kind of in documentary terms. The second wave are largely forgotten, but they are the Protestant ascendancy. So these are the families that are successful in the wars of conquest of Ireland, particularly in the Tudor, but also the Cromwellian settlement. And of course, very often they're the non-inheriting sons, so they have to find a career, and they find that career in the British Empire as soldiers and administrators. Sometimes they are the inheriting sons, but the aristocracy in Ireland, the landed gentry, often found that they couldn't make the estates pay, so they needed alternative careers. And when you see, for example, in the early colonial period, you have Guy Carleton, the man who saved Canada. He's from Strabane. His brother, Thomas, is Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick, the first one. At the same time, you've got John Parr from Dublin, who's Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. His Secretary of the Council is Richard Buckley from Dublin. Buckley arrives with the Cornwallis expedition in 1749. He's there for 50 years, and when he died, was known as the founding father of Nova Scotia. You have Walter Prendergast in what was then St. Anne's Island. He gets the local assembly to call it New Ireland because he wants more immigrants from Ireland, but the Privy Council in London overrules him, and he eventually becomes Prince Edward Island. So you have all of these, and George Hamilton was another, the lumber baron was another one of these highly influential figures. So you have a whole selection of Protestant ascendancy Irish people who are in Canada. I mean, for example, John Parr, Richard Buckley, and Thomas Carleton they were sorting out the borders between the provinces. They were also involved, for example, in the settlement of the Empire Loyalists from America in Canada. The white ones were given a good deal, but the black Empire Loyalists were not given a good deal, and in fact Buckley was involved in sending some of them plus the Maroon rebels from Jamaica back to Sierra Leone in Africa. But these guys were absolutely foundational to early colonial Canada and its administration, and they were Irish. And they weren't Anglo-Irish. We called them Anglo-Irish. They would not have seen themselves as Anglo-Irish. They would have seen themselves simply as Irish within the British Empire and clearly imperial. And that tradition continued with, for example, Wellington. So Wellington comes from Trim. Arthur Wesley. He's only a Wesley. He's actually the family is actually it's not a Collins. It's a Colley. They're actually Colleys, and they were in Ireland from the 1600s. His grandfather changed the name to Wesley because he inherited a estate from a relative, and then Wellington himself changed it to Wellesley. But these are a deeply rooted Irish family. His brother Richard conquers India between 1798 and 1803. More land and people than Napoleon, and set up the British Raj. Wellington obviously defeats Napoleon, but in the climactic battle with the French, Wellington is outraged by the War of 1812 and decides to create Fortress Canada. And to do that, he invests in the Rideau Canal. The Rideau Canal is a military defensive measure to allow for the relief of Montreal should the Americans cross the St. Lawrence, because Wellington believed that the Americans would try again to invade, because the War of 1812, as far as he's concerned, just as France is invading Russia, the War of 1812 is a stab in the back. So the Rideau Canal derives from Wellington's decision, we need to fortify and protect Canada. And so, of course, what that triggers, these building projects, the Lachine Canal, the Grenville Canal, the Rideau Canal, the building of the walls in Quebec City, the Citadel in Halifax, this brings in labor. So from 1800 to the 1820s, you have a wave. The next wave of immigration are Protestant farmers, because 1800 is a kind of a watershed moment. The Protestant Parliament is abolished. It's absorbed into the Union. 1798, very vicious sectarian outbreak of violence in southern Wicklow. So you have a Wicklow exodus, and Protestant immigrants outnumber Irish Catholics by about 2 to 1 in the 1800 to 1820 period. The next wave, though, are Catholic labourers coming in, because after the war, the Napoleonic Wars end in 1815, there's an agricultural depression in Ireland. The Catholics start coming in. They come in as labourers to work on the canals. Then they muscle in, after the canal is finished in 1832, they muscle in on the lumber industry. And of course, they're able to get farms. Then, of course, you've got the famine. But as Mark told me right from the beginning, I never forgot this, the famine immigrants end essentially mass migration from Ireland to Canada. And the settlement patterns in Canada were already well established and were not greatly influenced by the famine immigrants, although they did concentrate, for example, in Toronto and so on. But There's still another wave that comes, and I would call them broadly the influencers. So you have Irish figures coming into Canada after the famine. Thomas D'Arcy Mcke is the most famous because he's a founding father of Confederation. He shapes the constitutional debate because he says, we don't want to be America, we don't want to be like Ireland, we want to have a devolved democracy with rights for everybody and respect for everybody. But he's a very, very influential figure. But you've also got other influences. Nicholas Flood Davin from Ireland, he writes the report for John A. Macdonald that sets up the Indian residential school system because the belief at that time was that they had to be assimilated. The first commissioner of the the Northwest Mounted Police is George Arthur French from Roscommon, and he leads the famous March West in 1874. You've got John Macwan from Ireland, who is an obsessive collector of floral plants and becomes the founding father of natural history in Canada. His collection was so large they had to build the museum in Ottawa to house his collection, but he was a great advocate for settlement of the West, the prairies. John Palliser from Dublin, for 3 years, led the Palliser expedition in the Prairie Northwest, a brilliant scientific expedition that opened it up again to settlement. Because don't forget, Canada, up until Confederation, was confined to the East Coast. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police are effectively founded on the model of the Royal Irish Mounted Constabulary. Canadian jurisprudence is written pretty much by one man, James Robert Gowan from Wicklow. And it just goes on and on. Everywhere you see this Irish influence, it's just kind of below the surface all the time. So these influential figures begin to really shape Canada. And it carries on through the different generations. So when I go to work, on one side I have there's a statue of Arthur Currie, your most famous soldier from the First World War. But he spelled his name with C-U-R-R-I-E. His father spelled the name C-U-R-R-Y, and his grandfather spelled it C-O-R-R-I-G-A-N. They were Corrigans from Ireland. When I look to my left, there are the famous five, the women who advocated that women are in fact persons under the law, and they should be admitted to the Senate. But if you look at those five women, 3 of them are Irish Canadian, 2 of them have Irish-born parents, and 1 of them is a grandchild of James Robert Ogle Gowan, who was related to James Robert Gowan. Ogle Gowan from Wicklow was the first Grand Master of the Orange Order. And very few people are kind of aware that this huge influence of the Irish is here. So I would say that if you look at the Irish presence in Canada, we have to reframe it and understand it as part of a transatlantic colonialism. Immigration is a part of this, but this is a story about Britain and France recreating themselves in North America, in which the Irish play a huge role. Question then is, why is this forgotten? I think it's forgotten in Canada because coming to Canada for many meant that you're coming into a Protestant, British, royal and loyal society. And as David Wilson, the historian, said, if you're an Irish Republican in America, in the United States, you're going with the grain. If you're an Irish Republican in Canada, you're going against the grain. And so that's one part of it. I think the other part is that, and we've forgotten this in Ireland, and it's, I think, a deliberate omission. Up until 1916, I would say that Canada was the future Ireland never had. For the vast majority of constitutional nationalists in Ireland, they looked to Canada as the constitutional model. Give us back our parliament that was abolished in 1800, and we will be the second Dominion. As Daniel O'Connell himself said, 2 parliaments, 1 crown. And so Irish politicians like John Redmond and others, Parnell, were going to Canada on trips because they were saying, listen, we will be as loyal as the Canadians if you give us back our parliament. And that was true right up until 1916. But 1916 changes everything. It means that Irish nationalism suddenly becomes Republican. And in a way, our history of involvement in the empire becomes kind of an embarrassment. And so we hive it off. So we call the Protestant Irish, we call them Anglo-Irish, as if they're not quite qualified to be Irish. And there's this great, You know, when Yeats described 1916 as a terrible beauty is born, I say it's actually a terrible simplicity. It creates a simplistic idea of what Irish identity was, in which there wasn't this room for complexity. But I think now we're mature enough now to take what one historian said is a more appropriate relationship with history. History is complicated. We can't condemn these people for the decisions they made or for being part of a settlement process. These are the conditions that people lived in and had to make choices about for survival and prosperity and for the survival and prosperity of their own children. And we just have to accept that their decisions were complicated and they were forced by circumstance in many ways. So there's a really an amazing story to be told about the Irish in Canada. It's an epic story. It's lost behind not just our kind of official ideology about what a national identity is, what Irish national identity is. It's also lost because the famine becomes the great watershed in Ireland. And because after 1847, the vast majority of Irish immigrants are going to the United States, when you talk about emigration in Ireland, you think about the United States. You don't think about the Irish coming to Canada for 300 years and exerting such an influence. But if you look at the coat of arms, the Canadian coat of arms, if you look closely enough, at the bottom, there's a row of shamrocks. And I like that because that to me says actually Canada has an Irish foundation. Anyway, thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'd like to call on my friend Mark McGowan. Mark is professor of history and former principal of the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto, U of T, but also, I think most of us would agree, one of the leading historians of the Irish in Canada. Personal note, he was the external examiner for my PhD thesis. So I hope we don't get examined too closely here today.
Thanks very much, John, and thank you to all of you for the gracious hospitality that has been shown this Upper Canadian. I'm reminded of Scripture when Scripture says, the tongue of the fool foreigner is a lash for his back. So I'm hoping it doesn't end up that way with me today. I first was in this building. It's such an honor to be in this building. In 1997, I made my first trip to Newfoundland, certainly not my last, and I keep coming back. And it was John Fitzgerald who took me into this building and toured me, showed me the precious bits of history in this building. And it just reinforced in my mind that the story of the Irish in Canada is not a monolith. It's a story that's differentiated across the country. And that in a work that I'm writing now called The Irish in Canada, Community of Communities, that we have distinctive Irish societies right across Canada with different stories fed from different counties and different experiences upon their arrival and who greeted them either with a smile or with a shillelagh. In this particular case, John had toured me through the cathedral. It was prior to his defense. And we were out at a restaurant one evening, and we were talking about the history of the Irish in Newfoundland, and I started talking about the Sisters of Providence and the Nugents, and he looked at me with this strange look, because my evaluation of his dissertation had been completely anonymous. I like it that way. And I think he was on to me, and after his defense in Ottawa, he said, I think I knew you were my external all the time because nobody knows about the Presentation Sisters and the Nugents, but somehow you knew. So he must have read the dissertation. So I called them. So Presentation Sisters, the Mercy Sisters. On April Fool's Day, I announced my retirement from the University of St. Michael's College, and I wanted to keep them guessing. So I'm figuring this trip to Newfoundland, and I asked John, what do you want me to speak about? He said, anything you want. So this is mile 1 of Macwan's farewell tour. And what I'd like to do within that context then is talk a little bit about famine studies in Canada, but impart upon all of you and to those who are willing to take up the torch where we might go in the future. Okay? And I have 4 things to talk about. So if I really get boring, you can count down. Thank God he's at number 3, all right? So famine studies in Canada, as Eamon has pointed out, were really quite understudied for the longest time. And in the 1980s, there was a thrashing about between nationalist interpretation of the famine and the evil of Great Britain and the suffering of the Irish people, all of which based on a body of evidence, and revisionists who looked at tables and statistics and had a counter story. And that's the interesting thing about doing history. Once you think you've got the definitive tale, now you're going to be in trouble because there's always someone out there who's going to try to knock that peg off your shoulder. So in Canada, we messed around with this for about a decade and a half. And really we decided as a historical group that we could agree on a number of things. One, the famine was an end point in terms of mass migration, and it didn't affect greatly in terms of numbers certain parts of the country. Newfoundland, at least demographically, at least in terms of the people, only 2 ships came here. That it wasn't just a Catholic event. We discovered, lo and behold, that there were Church of Ireland, Methodist, and Presbyterians who were also affected by the famine. And they came from all parts of Ireland. The other thing that we recognized is that not all of these people settled in cities. We somehow had incorporated an American idea from film and from novels that the Irish huddled into ghettos and then created the fire departments' numbers and the police departments. And we imbued, in some ways, those American tales of, Chicago, Boston, New York, 5 Points, and the other American centers. In fact, many of those settlers went to the countryside. We also learned that for most part, it wasn't the evil landlords who had piled everybody on board coffin ships and sent them to Canada. In fact, only about 8% of those who came in 1847 were actually assisted by their landlords. So that now there are new questions that are raised. Who made the decisions to come? Why did they come? Did they come basically out of desperation? Some of them did. And some of them came willfully, sold everything they had, and came on their own. So we now have a body of knowledge that really hasn't seeped down, and it really is somewhere up there, and I'm looking at this very ethereal ceiling, and it's somewhere up there, and it doesn't often filter down. My own grandmother would say, well, Mark, we came over during the famine. Well, they didn't. They actually migrated in the 1820s. They were pre-faminites, but I didn't have the heart to tell my grandmother that. I mean, it's just, but I'm telling you. So the 4 things. Where can we go from here, now that we have the basic outlines of the famine story that are traced? First, I'm going to call genealogical. I'm a social historian. Too often our history in this country and in every province is written either from the desk of a parliamentarian or from the pulpit of a churchman. I like to see the view from the pew. And that is the view of average, ordinary people, often who don't leave their own records deliberately behind. Yes, sometimes they're diaries, sometimes they're letters. So we have to go into those routinely generated records that they didn't know would be preserved. census material, exciting things like tax assessment forms, okay? Baptismal registers, marriage registers, death registers. This genealogical approach is not new. John Mannion has been inspiring, he and Maura, in the way in which they've taken these routinely generated records and created a sense of who the people were that at least came to this province from Ireland. Bruce Elliott has done the same for Irish Protestants in Ontario. So the method isn't new, but to be applied to the famine is. And this genealogical method is the one that I employed and others have employed in looking at Irish migration. Let's put faces to those who came in these tragic years of the Irish famine. And that's how the Strokestown project essentially unfolded with my senior undergraduate students at St. Michael's College, who got credit for helping me hunt through hundreds and hundreds of records to uncover what happened to the 1,490 assisted immigrants from the Strokestown estate. Or the others who helped me track down 1,700 orphan children that many of you would have known by that historic vignette of Molly Johnson on television back in the 1990s. We have this new approach to looking at the real people who came using a different set of records that often historians ignore, but genealogists know all too well are the valuable keys to unlocking those stories. Okay, now if you're taking count, 1 down, 3 to go. The next one is local micro-studies. Eamon has made it fairly clear, and I've just reiterated the fact that these stories are different depending on what parts of the country you go to. In terms of the famine, one of the things that we're learning is that the study of local reception of famine migrants reveals all kinds of important nuggets that were ignored by other historians in the past. Here I'm going to refer to 2 recent studies. The first by Michael Mcke, a historian in Ottawa who has uncovered the story of famine migrants to that city when it was called Bytown. And one of the keys to understanding what happened there was the work of the women religious. And that is the Sœurs de Charité, in this case in Montreal, then the Sœurs de Charité de Ottawa under Elizabeth Bruyère. And now women are being written into the famine narrative, finally. The second study is one that Christine Keneally and Jason King made in a very public historical way on the Sœurs Grises de Montréal, the Grey Sisters, the Grey Nuns, and revealing online the annals that those sisters took as they were tending and dying for the sake of these famine migrants. The local studies are helping us piece together a very interesting quilt about what happened to Irish migrants before, during, and then after the famine, because the stories are different. There are things that tie these stories together, just like a quilt is sewn together and makes one beautiful piece of art. But what we also understand is that each one of those squares has variations, different colors, different shades, different patterns, all the same cloth. Number 3, gratitude. Oftentimes, we tend not to look at the societies that have received these migrants. And it's important now that we take a very close look at those receivers, the first responders. And in this case, the studies of gratitude have really started to pop to the surface. Christine Keneally's study of who gave globally to Irish famine relief. And we learned such interesting things as the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire wanted to give £5,000 for Irish famine relief. And the British government said no, because the Queen, Victoria, had only given £2,000 to Irish famine relief, and the Sultan could never give more than Her Majesty the Queen. So he gave £1,000. Tom Thumb, the performer in Barnum and Bailey Circus gave to Irish famine relief, and the list goes on. We know that the Choctaw people in the United States gave to Irish famine relief. And one of the more recent discoveries, but again, hidden in plain sight, and was in actually Patrick Mannion's, his work, the next generation of the Mannions, that we have this beautiful copy of the 507 from this place that gave to Irish famine relief despite the hardship of living in a burned out city in destitution because of what had been destroyed in June of 1846. And the wonderful thing is that now that links number 3 with number 1, because as you go, as Anne said at lunchtime, as you go and examine that record, you begin to find those links to real people who aren't just strangers, they're family. So this study of gratitude is new, and I think a very important way of accessing the social story of what happened during the famine. And I would also say that my own work now, then the accidental discovery, again, of documents hidden in plain sight with regard to Irish famine relief that was brought to them by the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And I'm just accessing on my phone a document which I think says it all. This was a letter that had been written in response to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, it was called at that time in Upper Canada, on St. Patrick's Day. He wrote to all of the nations and bands within his jurisdiction, and he asked them to help Irish and Scottish famine relief. The Scots, yes, in the Highlands and in the islands also faced a struggle with the potato crop failure repeatedly. And he begged them that they donate. I'm going to read you a very short letter just so that you know I'm not making this up as I go along. This is from the Mississaugas of Scugog, very close to me. I live in Whitby, Ontario, which is not Toronto. And this is the closest band of Indigenous peoples to us. They had been placed at Balsam Lake, which they found the ground infertile, and then had to buy back their own historical territories at Scugog Island and were deprived of shoreline on this island. There were 90 individuals living there, and they write this. Lake Scugog, March 30th, 1847. Sirs, I got your letter of the 17th March 1847 about the Irish and Scottish people who are very hungry and are in want of provisions. I called a council, and I had your letter explained. All my people are very sorry for the sufferings of their white brethren. They are very poor, but my people are willing to help their white brethren. And to you, I send word to the Governor General that the desire to send 5 pounds of our annuity to be sent to the people, either in money or provisions, as the Governor General thinks best. This is all I have to say. Signed, Jacob Crane, with his totem, his symbol, the symbol of his people, his clan, the symbol that linked him to the earth, the same symbols that were inscribed upon the treaties with the crown, because these people, in their own poverty, knew that they had a reciprocal relationship with the people within that treaty, that they were brothers under the crown. Sometimes I wish that the crown had been greater in honoring those treaty commitments. So the study of the other giving, I think, is an important feature. And you'll be pleased to know this is my last point. Public history. Those of us in the ivory tower, those of us in the academy, we speak gown to gown very well, but not gown to town. To share this story in a meaningful way in an age in which the book and the printed word has been supplanted in many ways by the electronic word, and that is public history. These shoes, the National Famine Way and the global Irish Famine Way, I think, are at the edge of a new education, not really new, but new for us, in seeing that film and music and museums and pilgrimage are all part of telling the story. The fact that you're here today, I think, is testament to the fact of how important this kind of public history is. History that scholars don't write to one another, but history that they make legible in a different way through different media. This Famine Way, the work that's been done by the Canada-Ireland Foundation, the work that's been done by the Irish Heritage Trust, I think is all signs of a new way, an important way of telling story through drama, through film, and the like. I was raised with a very traditional historical training at the stuffy old University of Toronto by the tweed-jacketed set that had dominated the study there for a long time. They weren't very happy that I was a social historian, and even my supervisor sometimes questioned why it took me so long to get to a point, as you're probably questioning now. But one of the things that they impart was this sort of reluctance to get involved in commemorations, monuments, and public history. And I think that has to change. I was once speaking with an archaeologist friend, and we were working on Death or Canada, which became not only part of a memorial to the Irish famine in Toronto, but a movie. And I said to my colleague, I said, have I really sullied myself in sort of getting involved in this kind of thing? And he said, Mark, listen to this. You'll write an article on the famine, and maybe 15 people will read it. You know, that really allows me to say to my mother, I really made a good career choice. He said, you might write a book on the famine, and maybe 50 people will see it or read it. But we made a movie about the famine, and 15,000 people are going to see that. So think about that and a vocation as a historian. We Irish have a story to tell, and we don't have to be imprisoned by the printed word to tell it. And so, as I close mile 1 of the farewell tour, I pass the torch to all of you. Don't be afraid to hunt down your story. Don't be afraid to share your story. Don't be afraid to collectively tell the story, in this case, of the Irish in Newfoundland. It's a good story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. By way of contrast, I'm going to speak briefly this afternoon on really sort of two things: ships, and not really many ships at all, and a newspaper article. And this is actually not really my research at all. This is the work of people like John Mannion, who we'll hear from shortly, and people like his son, Patrick Mannion, my former student, Mark's former PhD student, and also the newspaper article was found by Patrick Mannion and then refound for us by Maura and John, and I have copies for you. And it's on a big poster in the center of the church, so maybe we can, you might want to have a look at it later. So, ships and generally shipping. It is worth remembering that the principal source of protein for Europe for 400 years was the Newfoundland codfish. Newfoundland is Ireland's Talavanishk, the fishing grounds, or depending on your other European countries, the Terra de Bacalhau. You can go and have bacala or bacalhau in other countries. You can have salt codfish. You can have all kinds of magnificent dishes, and they all originated from 4 centuries of a migratory fishery that came across the ocean and took a great deal of risk to come across the ocean, on ferocious ocean, as you know, the North Atlantic, in sailing ships, until it was either 1842 or 43 when Samuel Cunard's steamship came into this port. Before that, it used to take, on average, as John Mannion has pointed out, between perhaps 6 to 7 weeks, maybe up to 10 weeks or 12 weeks, to go one way across the North Atlantic, whether it's from there to here or here to there. Imagine getting on Air Canada and having to take 12 weeks to get across the North Atlantic. We won't go there. So, and the other thing to tell you is, really, as you know, this place called Newfoundland was settled as a result of a migratory cod fishery. I will very briefly summarize, and I can even be corrected by the master himself, John Mannion, who pointed out that there is no known human migration from such an intensely local part of the Old World to such an intensely local part of the New World over such a long period of time. The period of time, the 1680s to the 1830s, the geographic region. If you wanted to put a barbershop pole down in the middle of the Irish Sea and draw a 100 or 150 sort of mile radius, you'd get that part of the Old World in southeast Ireland, in the West Country of England, and then you'd put another barbershop pole down over St. John's and you'd draw a 100-mile radius. That's where they settled. And if you look at the Irish migration, it's even tighter. It's maybe 60 miles around Waterford and maybe even a little bit less around St. John's. But this explains perhaps an important point that I'm not going to get into. We're going to leave that to John to talk about, which is why we didn't have a lot of famine immigrants to Newfoundland during the Irish famine. Okay, ships. 2 ships, as we've heard. There was a strong awareness in Newfoundland and among the Irish and among the community in this town that there was a huge famine going on in Western Europe, in Ireland, where family members, cousins, friends were suffering ferociously. It was reported in newspapers and letters. The news of the failure of the potato crop and the terrible suffering and starvation was well known. There was a considerable debate among Newfoundland newspapers whether to start a subscription, but among them, only Henry Winton's Public Ledger here in St. John's argued first that charity started at home, and if a subscription for relief was to be gotten up, he'd like to see it address famine and destitution in rural Newfoundland, which was starting to suffer from potato crop failures, as well as places like the Scottish Highlands, as well as in Ireland. The Times newspaper in St. John's reported on the 19th of May, 1847, that the ship Margaret Parker of St. John's arrived here on Monday, well freighted with passengers from New Ross. And it is pleasing to learn that all hands, save one sickly lad, are free of disease. We learn on the arrival of this vessel that a communication took place between some passengers and their friends on the shore, and that some of the passengers may have effected an escape from the ship before the medical officers appointed to examine and report on the state of emigrants could actually go on board. And the article went on and said, while we point out the propriety of having passengers visited and closely examined by proper and competent medical persons, we have every confidence in the medical person appointed to discharge such duty, and we at the same time should be glad that every means should be adopted to administer to the emigrants' wants during the period they may be retained on quarantine. As Patrick Mannion pointed out, the concern was perhaps less of the island being inundated by impoverished immigrants, but rather the fear of the risk of the outbreak of disease. And maybe these concerns were well-founded because an outbreak of typhus actually did take place in St. John's in June and July in Newfoundland and in St. John's in 1847. And then on the 21st of May, 1847, Henry Winton's Public Ledger in St. John's reported that the bark Bolivar, and of course we're into the theme of the Bolivar, with White as master, arrived at St. John's 37 days out of Waterford. Surely that must be a mistake. It's probably like 8 weeks, but nonetheless 37 days, he said. It had on board 174 passengers, 3 of whom died at sea. The Bolivar was a ship belonging to the Kent family. One of their number was John Kent, who was married to the sister of Bishop Fleming, who built this. And John Kent later became the second premier of Newfoundland. Winton reported, however, the breakdown of quarantine on the Bolivar. In visiting this vessel, he said the medical officer, Dr. Kiley, was prevented from going on board in consequence of the great number of shore boats that surrounded her, the people from which were crowding the decks, despite the efforts of the captain who tried to prevent it. Very interesting scene painted there. It suggests, more than suggests, that the people on board had connections with the people on shore, and the people on shore were trying to get to them, get them off those ships, try to come to their aid, come to their help. There's an interesting article written in the journal Newfoundland Studies, and I'd suggest you have a look at it, by George Castell. And he points out that an entirely different response to local famine and local suffering and to the Irish famine came from interesting quarters. There was also, as I said, a failure of potato crop, there were severe frosts, and the British colonial governor of Newfoundland, John Gaspard Lamarchand, decided to respond to famine by proclaiming a day of public fasting and humiliation, attributing the recent disasters not to natural causes, but to the heavy judgments with which Almighty God has been pleased to visit upon the iniquities of our island. Lamarchand hoped that this might induce the Almighty to withdraw his afflicting hand, so that the people of our said island may humble themselves before Almighty God in order to obtain the pardon of their sins. George Castell noted, if anyone questioned the wisdom or irony of imposing a fast on an already famished population and on arriving famine sufferers, even the local newspapers didn't pick up on this. How many famine emigrants arrived in Newfoundland? Patrick Mannion reports from the British parliamentary papers on immigration that 400 passengers left Ireland for Newfoundland in 1846 and 744 in 1847. But the local response in Newfoundland to the news of the famine was absolutely remarkable, given the size of this community, and particularly in this town. The 7th of April, 1847 newspaper, the Morning Courier, showed that the community gathered and raised funds to the tune of 1,090 pounds sterling. The local leading lights contributed to this from great to small and small to great. The Benevolent Irish Society led the way with 300 pounds sterling raised. And there were very significant contributions by Patrick Morris. The Lord Bishop of Newfoundland also made a remarkable contribution, but so did the Wesleyan Chapel. And sprinkled throughout, you'll see the other Christian denominations. You'll see a number of Scots merchants from the Kirk next door. Our friends are here today from the Kirk. Our friends are here from Gower Street United Church, the Wesleyan Chapel. St. Thomas's Anglican. In fact, if you look at it, you'll see right across the full spectrum of that society almost 200 years ago, people were genuinely moved and gave very greatly to this cause. So this 507 names or so doesn't represent just the Irish in Newfoundland, most of whom were Roman Catholic, but also a remarkable cross-section of the whole community and the Christian community in eastern Newfoundland at the time. I would just read a few names to you, just to get a bit of a sense here. E and N Stab, C. D. Newman, John Cusack, Patrick Keogh, Matthew Stewart, Reverend Dr. Fleming, Reverend R. Williams, James Byrne, and we could go on and on. There's also a really important local context for this aid to the famine sufferers, and that is, this was a substantial fundraising in a community that less than 1 year earlier had suffered the destruction and devastation of most of St. John's by the fire of 1846. There was a map in the center of the Basilica, which you might want to have a look at, from the Colonial Office paper showing the complete layout of what was destroyed in the fire. For a community already reeling from the losses, the self-discipline and the determination to aid famine sufferers, given their own privations from this community, was remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And of course, the fire of 1846 casts this into a high relief, because as was pointed out and will be pointed out again, it wasn't just the town that was destroyed, it was the means of sustenance, because those merchants, if you will, were the Loblaws, Dominions, and Sobieses of the day, and the local population had their access, unless they had vegetable gardens, they had access to food and supplies and provision for fisheries, all wiped out. That fire destroyed also the Anglican Church on Church Hill, Presentation Convent and School at the top of Longs Hill, and all but one merchant's premises located in the neighborhood of Riverhead, which is the foot of Patrick Street. 12,000 citizens representing 57% of this city's population were left homeless, and the damage was estimated at £888,000 sterling, of which only $195,000 was covered by insurance. This building wasn't complete, this cathedral, and it was north of the path of the fire and was thus unharmed. The old Catholic chapel on Henry Street was also to the northwest fire and was spared. But then even a couple of months later, in September 1846, there was a ferocious windstorm after the fire, and it destroyed fishing premises throughout the outports of Newfoundland, shattered fishing boats, stages, flakes, destroyed supplies, and left devastation in its wake. And it meant that since the mercantile premises in St. John's had been destroyed by fire, rebuilding after that storm was all the more difficult because the merchants were in ruin themselves and unable to advance necessary supplies to rebuild the destroyed premises throughout the island. So the kindness and the empathy of this community, who were very aware of the suffering and devastation caused by famine in Ireland, were made manifest at a time when it cost them most dearly as well. Here I'd like to do an interesting thing. If you know, or if you have seen this, would anyone here today who knows that they are descended from someone on that Morning Courier list, or they represent someone or one of the institutions like the Wesleyan Chapel, or the Kirk, or the Church of England, or is affiliated with any of these congregations, would you folks please put up your hand? We're seeing lots of hands. Yeah. So during our question and answer session, which Anne is going to deal with shortly, I'd like to invite you to come to the microphone and identify yourself. You have a newspaper article, you've had some ships. Two last points. There's a model of the Dunbrody, the Irish famine ship, which is over here on display. The original is sunk, crashed into the shore in Labrador in the late 19th century. It was rebuilt. The ship was rebuilt. It's in New Ross Harbor. And the John F. Kennedy Trust sold those things, and I bought one a number of years ago to help support the reconstruction of the ship. But the historical work on the interpretation of the Dunbrody was done by John and Maura Mannion. So they know all about these kinds of ships. The other point is, one of the most precious documents we have in this cathedral is called the Cathedral Register, and it's in that case, display case over there, and it's a list, a ledger book from 1837 to 1850 of ships, ship's crews, and the people who donated, as well as fishermen and sealers who donated to the building of this. It's open to the year 1847, and what's remarkable is they were still donating to this while they were donating to the famine. So they saw the causes as being remarkably dear to their hearts. I'm going to step back, and I'm going to invite Carolyn Callery to come and speak from the National Famine Museum at Strokestown.